Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister, told her party at its annual conference that Scotland is now on the verge of independence from the rest of the UK. Her handling of coronavirus has been much praised. But should it have been? She joins me now from Glasgow. Nicola Sturgeon, you've talked a lot about the low prevalence in comparison of coronavirus in Scotland and other countries. But when you look at the data, isn't the truth that Scotland has the third worst record in deaths from coronavirus of any country in Europe in the first wave?
The number of deaths in Scotland is far too high. You won't hear me say any different. I don't think there is an acceptable level of deaths. What I would say is, firstly, and you know, I don't think it should be seen as a competition, but you've asked me the question in a comparative sense. We've got a lower death rate, if I can use that term, than England and Wales. There are particular issues in Scotland which will not be unique to Scotland, you know, different demographics, some intergenerational issues of long-term health conditions. But perhaps the most fundamental point, which applies to all countries, is this one. We are still in the teeth of this pandemic. So it's, I think, premature for any country to be declaring victory or assessing performance against others. Every single day right now, my focus is on trying to do the best I can with my Scottish Government colleagues to suppress the virus, to drive levels of the virus down. We're not complacent about that, but we do have a lower prevalence of the virus at the moment than the other nations of the UK. But of course we've got to work on that every single day. None of us are finding this an easy challenge to face.
Well, you say that, but again the data doesn't really back you up. If you look at the last 4 weeks in terms of death rates from COVID, that's COVID-19 on the death certificate. And we've looked at the figures from the ONS and the National Records of Scotland. On every week, the Scottish death rate is considerably worse than the English death rate, week after week after week. Week 43, England 16 per million deaths per million, Scotland 19 deaths per million. Week 44, 22 for England, 30 for Scotland. Week 41, 31 for England, 37 for Scotland. And the last week for records, England 40 and Scotland 50. So you have actually done worse than England over the last second wave. Have you let the people of Scotland down?
Well, that's for the people of Scotland to judge. I am working as hard as I can every day. Look, you're inviting me to sort of defend a particular level of deaths, and I'm, obviously I'll address your questions, but I don't think there is any level of deaths that is acceptable. Certainly if you look cumulatively, though, since the start of the pandemic, per million of population, Scotland's death rate, that's a term I hate using, but I'll use it for shorthand right now, is quite significantly lower than England's and Wales. It's higher than Northern Ireland. Certainly the last week I've been looking at, which I think was the week up to the 25th of November, it was a bit lower than England and Wales as well. But you know what? Across the whole of the UK, across much of Europe, far more people have died from this virus than any of us feel comfortable with. Not just for the however long I'm First Minister, but probably for the rest of my life, I will deeply regret the number of people who've lost their lives in the face of this virus. I have done everything and will continue to do everything I can to try to control the virus, to keep it as low as possible, to take the tough decisions that have to be taken in order to achieve that, and to try to take people of Scotland along in these difficult steps with me as far as I possibly can. But nobody underestimates the pain, the grief, the suffering that this global pandemic has brought to us, and certainly I never will. And I feel, as you can probably tell, deeply uncomfortable at almost a sort of traditional political who's better than somebody else at this. This has been, a tragedy and a trauma for Scotland, for the UK, and indeed for the whole of the planet.
What about people dying in Scottish care homes? Because again, we've gone back to the data, and looking at a report by the University of Stirling, 47% of the deaths in Scotland were in care homes. That's a lot higher than, for instance, in England, where it was 30%. Terrible in both cases. The government down here got a lot of hostility directed at it because of what happened, but your situation was even worse.
Well, you and I have had this discussion before, Andrew. I think we had this discussion in depth the last time I was on the programme. And again, let me preface this by stressing that nothing I am about to say is intended to minimise in any way the tragic toll that coronavirus has taken in our care homes. And you say there has been hostility to the government in the UK. There's been intense debate and scrutiny of this in Scotland as well, rightly so. But the point I made to you the last time, which again doesn't minimise this, is that if you look at excess deaths overall in care homes across the UK, excess deaths in Scotland have actually been lower than in England, but a higher proportion of these excess deaths have been attributed to COVID. So in England, more of the excess deaths have been attributed to other things and certainly not to COVID. So that, I think, does lead me to say that that simplistic view that care home death toll is worse in Scotland perhaps doesn't bear that scrutiny. But again, I'll keep coming back to this point, Andrew. The death toll is unacceptable in Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, across much of Europe. This is a global pandemic that has brought huge grief and suffering, and this kind of debate, which is important for scrutiny and accountability, but if it starts to sound as if people like me are sort of minimising this, then that would be deeply wrong.
And it's a bit macabre, but nonetheless, back in July you said to me, what I absolutely do not accept is that we have a particular problem with care homes in Scotland. And I put it to you that is absolutely wrong. You decided that nobody would be moved to a care home without negative tests. And yet your health secretary admitted last week that that has been happening in some cases, patients being sent to care homes right now. Why did you break that pledge?
Well, can I come on to that specifically, because it's a really important point, one that I've had lengthy discussions with my clinical advisors about. But firstly, just to, I suppose, address the quote that you put to me there. I remember that discussion. It's the one that I quoted at you a moment ago. I wasn't saying we didn't have a problem with care homes. What I was doing, as I've done in the course of this interview, is, I suppose, challenge this idea with that explanation around excess deaths that Scotland's problem in care homes is worse than it is in England. So that's what I was doing. I wasn't trying to say there wasn't an issue in care homes. Now, in terms of the testing position in care homes, which was broadly the same across the UK, and came from the fact that at an earlier stage in this pandemic there was less understanding of asymptomatic transmission and more doubts about the efficacy of testing people who didn't have symptoms. As the advice on that changed, so did our policy. So we have a policy in Scotland. If somebody is in hospital for COVID, then before they can be discharged to a care home, they have to have 2 negative tests. If they're in hospital for a non-COVID reason, they still have to have a negative test before being discharged to a care home. Now, that's the policy, but as anybody, and this is the point about discussions with clinicians, as anybody knows, every policy in a clinical setting has to have exemptions if there are exceptional circumstances. So, for example, if an older person is getting towards the end of their life, if they're perhaps not capable of consenting to the test, but there is a decision that says that they would be better in their own homes, which for that person would be a care home, then it would be unethical to carry out an invasive test in those circumstances. So these are a small number of cases, clinically driven, and it would be deeply wrong for politicians to second guess the judgments of clinicians in these small number of cases. Right,
let's turn to education. 5 years ago, you said that the attainment gap between kids from the poorest families and children from better off families had to be closed, and it was an absolutely important part of your job. It wouldn't be done immediately, but it was absolutely crucial. And the attainment gap is even higher than it used to be. It's now 20.7 points for primary pupils in literacy and 16.8% for primary pupils in numeracy, and it gets worse as you go through Scottish schools. You said then that this was a moral challenge for Scotland and you wanted to be judged by that. On that judgment, you've failed.
It would surprise you to hear I don't accept that characterisation. I also don't think it is correct, and the evidence doesn't bear it out that the attainment gap is getting wider. What I absolutely stand by is that people in Scotland should judge me on my record on education and a whole range of other things, and they'll get the opportunity to do that, of course, in a few months' time when we have an election to the Scottish Parliament. On education, on a number of indicators, we see evidence of the attainment gap closing. We've had over the last few years an attainment challenge with significant additional funding, so we have record levels of investment in many areas. Per head of population per pupil, spending is higher in Scotland than other parts of the UK. We've got more teachers in our schools than at any time in more than a decade. More, well, let me complete. Well, the gap is not widening. That's the point I'm taking head on here. We see more young people from deprived backgrounds leaving with qualifications, hires in particular. The gap in terms of young people from richer and poorer backgrounds going to university is narrowing as well. There are record numbers of pupils from deprived areas going into university. Is it job done? Absolutely not. I don't say that for a second. But are we making progress? The attainment challenge I referred to a moment ago, the assessment of that, around 9 out of 10 head teachers themselves say that they see evidence of the attainment gap closing. So this is work still to do. One of the things the Scottish Government is absolutely focused on is making sure that we challenge some of the poverty-related reasons for the attainment gap, which is why the announcement yesterday from the Deputy First Minister, if we are re-elected, we will extend free school meals and breakfast to all primary school children all year round, because hunger in schools is one of the reasons that gets in the way of pupils' attainment. So this is something that we are focused on, committed to, and that will continue to be the case.
Alex Salmond has been exonerated of all charges. Would you like to see him back in the Scottish National Party?
Look, I'm not going to get into these issues today, for the reason being that there is a parliamentary inquiry underway. There's an inquiry into my conduct in terms of the ministerial code. I think it's important to allow these inquiries to take their course. And of course, the other thing that I'm very mindful of, and of course Alex Salmond was acquitted in a court of law, nobody can gainsay that. But in terms of the Scottish Government procedure here, it started with complaints coming forward from women. And if these women are listening to this, I think they deserve not to hear this just be treated purely as a political issue. There are important issues of political scrutiny and accountability. I have no issue with that, but I think it's important to take the processes underway, allow those processes underway to take their course. It's
not a purely political issue, but it is an issue of candour. We discussed this in a previous interview in 2018, and I'm just going to play the clip of what was said then. You've had one huge distraction through all of this period, which is the position of Alex Salmond. You know him well, you keep your ear to the ground. Had you heard any stories about him before it broke in the press?
Of this nature, absolutely not. Until, well, I've said previously, Alex Salmond informed me about these complaints in April. That was the first I had known.
Was that true?
I stand by what I said back then, and this will be core
first you
to
knew
the
was in April.
inquiry underway with the Scottish Parliament.
Well, you say the first you knew was in April.
Around,
you say the first you knew was in April, but
what I knew and when.
I'm sorry, but you've given written submission to the inquiry saying that you knew in November 2017. You told me you knew in April, 6 months later. There is a big gap between what you said to the inquiry and what you said to my viewers.
With the greatest of respect, Andrew, you're conflating two issues. When I spoke to you then, I was speaking about the issues that had been raised under the Scottish Government processes. I've set out written evidence on that, and I will give oral evidence to the inquiry. What I've also set out in that written evidence is that Sky News, back in November the previous year, had raised a query about allegations about Alex Salmond. They never at that time ran that story, and that's what what I've set out in the written evidence that I was aware of back then. So you're conflating two separate issues, but these are issues that I will set out, have already set out to the Scottish Government inquiry, and will do that when I get the opportunity to speak to them in person.
I asked you just what you knew about Alex Salmond at that time. I didn't narrow it down at that point. It seems to me that there is a gap between presentation, very, very good presentation, and the reality. When it comes to coronavirus data, when it comes to education, when it comes to the Alex Salmond issue, there is a gap between how you present yourself very, very effectively and what's really been going on in Scotland.
Well, I don't accept that, but ultimately, Andrew, the judge of that will not be me, and with the greatest of respect to you, the judge of that will not be you. The judge of that will be the people of Scotland, and I don't take that judgment for granted. I work hard every day to make sure that the substance of what the Scottish Government is delivering is as it should be. We're not perfect, we're not infallible, we get things wrong, we've got things wrong in coronavirus, but I don't shy away from that, and I'm being pretty clear with the Scottish people about the challenges we face, and I will continue to be so, and I will put myself, my government and my record before the people of Scotland next May, and it will be their decision as to whether they re-elect the SNP, as I hope they will, or not. And I'm perfectly comfortable with that scrutiny and that judgment.
OK, and it's certainly not my job, it's the people of Scotland. But on the final point, you told the people of Scotland yesterday that you could see independence in clear sight. If they voted SNP and you got a majority, it would happen. Can I put it to you also, that is simply not true. Boris Johnson has made it very, very clear he's not going to give you the referendum in the next few years that you want. And as things stand, you have absolutely no answer, no comeback to that.
Well, you see, I'm a Democrat, Andrew, and you may want to, and I don't mean this personally, of course, but you may want to accept the kind of deferential position to Boris Johnson. I believe that I'm accountable to and take instructions from the people of Scotland, not from Boris Johnson. And I'm going to do the old-fashioned, traditional democratic thing. I'm going to ask the people of Scotland in May for their authority, for a legal referendum to allow people in Scotland to choose their own future. And, you know, with the greatest respect, that's the democratic argument, and it is not for Boris Johnson to stand in the way of people choosing their future.
We hear you loud and clear, Nicola Sturgeon. Thanks very much for